Hello, this is equalise the chess noob, learning and having fun with chess. A couple of days ago, I published a video on why rooks on the 7th rank, or the 2nd rank if you are playing with the black pieces, are particularly powerful. Today I had another game where this tactic was once again an important factor for both myself and the opponent. Please enjoy! Let's start with the review. So chess.com's algorithm, I played okay, 80% accuracy, opponent 71%, and reasonably balanced in the opening, but sort of in the early mid-game, I make some blunders, which gives my opponent good advantage, but I managed to equalize by the late middle game, and in the end game, I managed to win. And as I sort of mentioned in the title, this game is about rooks on the 7th, so that ended up being quite important towards the end. We both played some good moves. My opponent, interestingly, had a brilliant move, which we'll see in context, but also some errors as well. Let's now move on to the analysis. So I played this game with the black pieces and the opponent white. They led with c4, so the English opening. I responded with e5, they played knight c3, I played knight f6, so all very standard at the moment. G3, and apparently this ends up being sort of this particular variation, so a lot of complexity in the English. I don't know any theory in the English, so I just try to play sensibly, I suppose. And now that I've got, so 1, 2, and the queen there, I thought potentially I could play d5, try to take control of the center. So capture with knight, and obviously knight can't immediately capture back. But, the fianchetto bishop there with an extra attacker makes sense. So rather than trying to do any sort of additional defense, so, here Stockfish reckons that undeveloping was best. I thought let's just play aggressively, get rid of that knight, and we'll see how things go. I play a bishop c5, e3, short castles, knight e2, and now I'm feeling reasonably good here, having sort of a number of attackers here, but at the same time, opponent has a good number of defenders as well. So a bit of a stalemate in sort of the battle for the d4 square. Bring an extra attacker with the knight. Opponent now short castles, very equal. So that apparently was a mistake for them. That's pretty obscure to me, but I think we're both reasonably equal, I think. The Stockfish now reckons that jamming the queen onto the d3 square is good, and I can see why, but I'm not sure I have the gumption really to do that. Feels like I could end up trapping my queen in some way. Opponent now plays d3. I bring the queen forward to square, d7. I was just trying to play some improving moves. I wasn't entirely sure what was the best move here. So moving the queen forward, connecting the rooks, surely that must be good. Opponent plays rook b1 with attack on my b7 pawn. Here I decided to play rook a b8 to defend that pawn. I did see that I could potentially put a rook behind my queen with a sort of a strong attack potentially against the opponent's queen. I thought, however, I would defend that first. Opponent now plays b2, so bishop b2, which is okay. However, that pawn is hanging, so I capture that. So if not for that one pawn loss, we're basically equal in position. Opponent plays rook c1. I thought that my concern was having the bishop there, that it's not really contributing very much, and I was worried that it could get trapped, like essentially, for example, potentially with a move like c4. So I thought I'd better move my bishop back out. So apparently that wasn't the best move, and I lose some of my advantage. Again, the Stockfish reckons that putting the rook behind the queen, attacking, is the best move here. Opponent now plays a good move, d4, and here I make a mistake, make a blunder by bringing bishop back to d6, missing the fact that that pawn now can move forward a second time with a fork. So of course, +3 now, so that was a serious error. Good move for the opponent in seeing that. And here I had to think, okay, what am I going to do? So I thought, yep, that knight is lost. So let's try to make some threats, make some sort of a. If you make counter threats, potentially the opponent will make a blunder. They capture back, opening up that file. The opponent sort of moves that bishop out of the way. And here I blunder right against. Here they make a blunder. That is a straight up loss of that bishop. Now, what I saw was if I do that, then their queen can capture, and surely that's a problem, forgetting the very fact that my queen is actually in fact defended by the bishop all the way there. At the same time, if they don't take and they capture, then I can straight up move the queen out of the way. So that was a straight up blundered piece. I should have captured, but I didn't quite see the strategy. I was playing reasonably quick. So here I capture, so blunder, blunder, blunder. You know, that's a sequence of blunders is sometimes what happens. That's all right. Opponent captures. Here I bring the rook behind the queen to give an extra defender. I expected that capture, opted to capture back with queen to, you know, that apparently wasn't a good move. But I thought if we moved to a queenless game, I might potentially be able to do something, especially given that these files are open. So this is what I saw, that these files are open and right onto the second rank. So, you know, the rank basically immediately in front of the opponent's back rank. I thought that this was actually going to be pretty good for me. And that's why I opted to make that transformation. Interesting, Stockfish does not agree. So of course, Stockfish is with perfect play. In the actual game, this ended up being very beneficial, as you will see. Opponent now wants to come to my 7th rank. So because they're white, it actually is the 7th. I play b2 now, so basically pressuring that knight, and that knight doesn't have very many good places to go. If we see, they defend with their other rook, so rook fe1. I now bring the other rook onto the second rank. So now lined up for the attack. So even if they take, I can take back, and then with them two, and you know that would be good. So basically, I win back potentially my lost position. Opponent now captures, and that was apparently a brilliant move. So that's quite interesting. Of course, I can capture that as well, but more importantly, that is a back rank mate because I can block, capture, yeah. So basically, I must give an escape square for my king, which I do. They capture the pawn. And here I could straight up capture now. I thought I might just take my king out of that position first. Now the reason that's an error is that I thought they couldn't prevent that. But of course they actually can. They can just bring the king back to that square, or potentially that square as well. And the king now defends the knight. Meaning that I really can't take that capture because then I'll lose both my rooks. However, they didn't do that. They went greedy and decided to take another pawn. And now I capture the opponent's knight. They capture, I capture back. And as we can see, their advantage, particularly with the extra piece, is now lost. I've recaptured the piece. Remember, I lost a knight early on. I've managed to recapture that knight. So I've got 4 pawns. They've got 4 pawns, all next to each other. But the opponent had an extra pass pawn, which should actually give them a significant advantage. But you know, in this position, given that my rook is probably more active, it's not as great as what you might think. So the opponent plays rook a6, taking their eye off that of their passed pawn, which is probably a mistake because I can now immediately attack it. And you can see Stockfish actually thinks bringing the rook back to the c file was the best move, because the problem here is that that rook on guard duty is kind of stuck because they cannot move that pawn forward without me capturing. Now, what the opponent really needs to do is to move the king over to be able to support that pawn and maybe to also to attack that rook, but it's not so easy because if they come this way, the rook basically cuts them off from the rest of the pawns. So what do? So I play f5. The opponent tries to move their king. I now sort of start to bring my king forward because I need to escort my pawns. They move again. I move the king forward again. Here they try to do a check. allows me to move the king forward. I'm actually trying to move the king forward. And now I've got infiltration points. Opponent plays rook a4 with check, thinking that that they could, I think, potentially move that pawn forward. And I suppose that's a good idea, but now I completely take out the rest of these pawns. And so that's a real problem because they're putting all their investment into that passed pawn, and that king is not supporting that pawn yet. Pawn moves forward, and this king is isolated from that pawn. And generally, you just can't push a pawn with just a pawn and rook against the rook. So I capture that pawn, and these other pawns are now going to fall sooner or later. King moves forward, capture, check, that's fine. And here I now move, starting to move my pawn. So this pawn is now a passed pawn. I want to protect it. The sort of king moves out of the way, wanting to attack the bottom of my chain. That's cool. Move my pawn forward. Move e2. Now on the effectively 2 squares away from promotion. Capture. That's fine. Let's just get rid of that threat once and for all. The king tries to move back, but my rook at the moment completely cuts off this king from those two pawns. So I've actually taken it out of the game. Move my king to d3. Again, the king needs to support the pawns going for promotion. Yep, move the king out of the way. That's fine. And now, that doesn't really work. So if you capture, straight up, capture that pawn. And now my rook defends that pawn. So yep, that's fine. Now, I can't get too greedy and take that because if rook captures, then my king is cut off from the rest of my pieces. So can't do that. So move my king back to f3, capture, happy to lose that. Now I do need to be careful because that is now a passed pawn. And if I end up trading, let's say trading rooks somehow with the opponent, it is quite possible that this pawn will be faster than my king and they will promote. So I need to be very careful of that. So bring my other pawn forward, f4. Now these are protected pass pawns. One pawn protects the other. King is in a little cocoon. It's not easy for a rook to give checks against a king when the king can sort of slide between sort of these diagonal positions of the pawns. They move the rook all the way back up to g1, which makes sense. Let's attack. Yep, that's fine. And see, move out of the way. There is no check available for the rook now, and this king is still stuck on their back rank. And now that pawn is lost. There is no possible way that they can now defend. So, yep, capture, and so it's getting closer to the end. So move the king back, and the reason they had to do that is if they didn't do that, whoops. King defends all those squares. This pawn also defends that one. So if rook is not there to protect, it will be straight up checkmate. So invitation, do you want to trade? Obviously it does not. Move the king out of the way. Yep, rook forward. Let's move the king out of the way. The king is trying to, do opposition, but I've got pawns. Check. Let's move the other pawn. And basically all is lost. Pretty much all is lost. That's fine. And here, what I opted to do, promote, basically with check. So either the king must move out of the way, and if they do, the rook is lost, or they have to capture, and I can capture with promotion, which is what happened. And we're sort of within sort of mate in 2. Opponent sort of opted to resign at this point. Good game, GG. In this game, my opponent underappreciated the problem of me having both my rooks on the second rank, allowing me to effectively equalise from what was a losing position for me, and entering into a rook and pawn endgame. Rook and pawn endgames are challenging, but there are some basic principles. For instance, supporting your passed pawns, and aim to have protected passed pawns, so two or more pawns supporting each other. Also, a rook by itself often cannot successfully escort a pawn to promotion against an opponent's rook. Activating the king is vital, and generally the king is required to escort pawns. In fact, a rook on its own often cannot prevent the promotion of a pawn when it is escorted by the king. Thus, cutting off the opponent's king from their pawns using your rook can be a winning strategy in these endgames. I hope you enjoyed this video, and thanks for watching.